The Games Channel.
All games, all the time. And now, let the games begin.
Once upon a time, there was a boy and girl who loved to play the dress-up game.
We love to play the dress-up game.
The dress-up game is also an imagination game, so you get 2 games in one.
Oh, boy!
They dressed up as pirates and imagined they sailed the 7 seas.
I'm a pirate. Arr!
Me too, matey. Arr!
We'll search for buried treasure. Arr!
Whack! Avast, ahoy! Walk the plank! Pieces of 8! Yo-ho-ho! Whack! And they dressed up as a king and a queen and imagined they ruled the land.
I'm a king.
I'm a queen. We rule.
All hail, Fredonia! Whack! And they dressed up as cowpokes and imagined they rode the open range.
I'm a cowboy.
I'm a cowgirl. Yeehaw! Giddy-up!
Yippee-ki-yay!
Ah! Kids, time for bed.
And they dressed up in their pajamas and went to bed.
Good night.
Good night! Ah! The end.
Coming up next on the Games Channel, Jump Rope.
By Alfred Hopscotch.